Imagine waking up one morning feeling unusually weak. You've got chills, a nasty fever, and when you glance down, there's this weird, painful lump forming under your arm. You don't realize it yet, but this is the start of something terrifying, a disease that will wipe out half of your village within weeks. Welcome to 14th century Europe, and congratulations, you've just caught the Black Plague. The Black Plague, or Black Death, ripped through the medieval world from about 1347 to 1351, killing anywhere from 75 to 200 million people, up to half of Europe's population. Yeah, half. To put it into perspective, imagine half of everyone you've ever met suddenly gone. That's how devastating it was. But here's the thing, it wasn't just an illness, it was a societal nightmare. No antibiotics, no vaccines, and absolutely no clue how it was spreading. So, today, let's dive into exactly why you, a perfectly average medieval person, would not have survived the Black Plague. First, let's set the scene. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly the clean, romanticized era you see at Renaissance fairs. Life back then was tough, gritty, and incredibly unhygienic. Forget the movies. There was no glamorous life in castles for most people. You would have lived in a cramped, crowded town, probably sharing your home with your entire family and maybe even some livestock. Hygiene, non-existent. Streets were literally filled with waste. Garbage and human waste, actual sewage, was thrown directly onto the streets. You'd dodge filth just to walk down to your local market. Rats? They were everywhere, your constant companions, always scurrying around, spreading who knows what. And if you think water was the answer, think again. Clean water was scarce, and people relied heavily on beer or wine because fermentation killed off some of the nasty germs. Sure, that sounds fun, but imagine never having easy access to safe drinking water. Your immune system would have already been compromised, making you incredibly vulnerable to illness. Nutrition? Horrible. Most medieval diets consisted of bread, often moldy, some vegetables, and a rare bit of meat or fish. Without a balanced diet, your body couldn't handle serious infections. Then there's the fact that cities and towns were bursting at the seams. Overpopulation in cities like London, Paris, or Florence meant people were living practically on top of each other. When a disease hit, it didn't just spread, it exploded. Now imagine this. You're living in a tiny, overcrowded house with your extended family. Your cousin gets sick first, just a fever at first, but soon he's delirious, covered in boils and coughing violently. Within days, everyone in your house is sick and you have nowhere else to go. Sanitation measures? Not even close to being developed. The idea of disease prevention barely existed, and quarantine procedures were chaotic or ineffective. Authorities didn't understand what they were dealing with, so often they'd seal entire families inside their homes to stop the plague spreading, essentially sentencing everyone inside to certain death. If you were unlucky enough to be living in a crowded urban centre, and let's face it, you probably would have been, you were basically trapped. And in these conditions, survival was more about luck than anything else. So, you're probably wondering, how did this devastating disease actually spread so fast? Medieval people definitely didn't know the answer, but today we do, and trust me, it's not pleasant. At its core, the plague is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Now, here's how this nasty little organism gets around. It typically begins with fleas. Yes, those tiny, jumping insects you usually associate with pets. Back in medieval Europe, fleas thrived because rats thrived. And both fleas and rats loved the unsanitary conditions I mentioned earlier. Here's how it goes down. A flea bites an infected rat and sucks in blood containing the plague bacteria. Now infected, this flea gets blocked internally. Basically, its digestive tract clogs up. Gross, right? The starving flea, desperate for food, jumps onto the nearest warm body, usually a human, and bites, regurgitating bacteria right into your bloodstream. That's right, the flea literally vomits plague bacteria into you. But wait, it gets even worse. The plague comes in 3 terrifying forms. The most famous, and common during the medieval period, is the bubonic plague. This is the one that gives you those nasty lumps or buboes, hence the name bubonic. These swollen, painful lumps form in your lymph nodes, typically under your arms, around your groin, or on your neck. Within days, symptoms escalate into fever, chills, muscle aches, and delirium. Then there's pneumonic plague, the respiratory version. Imagine the deadliest flu you've ever heard of. Violent coughing, chest pain, and eventually coughing up blood. Unlike bubonic plague, pneumonic plague spreads directly from person to person through droplets from coughs or sneezes. Back in medieval Europe, crowded housing meant if one person had pneumonic plague, the whole house was likely doomed. Lastly, there's the rare but almost always fatal septicemic plague, where the bacteria invade your bloodstream directly, causing sepsis, organ failure, hemorrhaging, and rapid death, often within just 24 hours. You could literally go from healthy to deceased overnight. So, picture yourself. You're living in medieval Paris or London. You're surrounded by rats, fleas, and thousands. Now, if you somehow managed to get sick, you'd obviously want to seek medical help, right? Here's the catch. Medieval medicine wasn't just ineffective, it often made things a lot worse. Doctors back then had no idea bacteria existed. Germ theory? Centuries away. They believed illness was caused by imbalances in your body's 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So their treatments aimed to restore balance. This meant practices like bloodletting, leeches, and even purging with laxatives. Bloodletting was incredibly popular, involving slicing a vein open and draining large quantities of blood. Imagine being already weak from fever and infection, then losing even more of your blood. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. It makes everything worse. And if bloodletting didn't appeal to you, there were always leeches. Medieval doctors loved leeches because they believed these creatures gently balanced your blood. Spoiler alert, they didn't help. In fact, they often introduced even more infections into your bloodstream. Doctors also prescribed bizarre concoctions, herbal mixtures, animal dung, and crushed emeralds, none of which did anything to stop the plague. Some patients were even told to rub onions, garlic, or herbs on their infected boils. While these remedies did nothing medically, they at least masked the awful smell coming from infected sores. Yeah, things were that bad. Then there were the plague doctors, the iconic figures in long coats, gloves, hats, and terrifying bird-like masks filled with herbs and spices. Although this look is now famous, it barely protected the doctor and offered no medical help to patients. Their cure mostly involved separating the sick, burning clothes, or fumigating houses with smoke. Picture yourself in their care. Sick, terrified, feverish, and now subjected to brutal, painful treatments that drained your remaining strength and almost certainly sealed your fate. In the middle of all this chaos, people desperately search for explanations. Unable to understand the medical causes, medieval Europeans turned to religion, superstition, and paranoia. Religion dominated medieval life, and people believed the plague was a divine punishment. This led to mass penitence, town-wide processions, public prayers, and even groups called flagellants who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves publicly to appease an angry god. Unfortunately, this religious fervour worsened the crisis by gathering large crowds, perfect for spreading the disease. Imagine attending a prayer service hoping for divine protection, only to unknowingly expose yourself and your family to infected neighbours. Others blamed marginalised groups. Jews, lepers, foreigners, and even beggars were falsely accused of poisoning wells or spreading illness deliberately. Horrifically, this led to pogroms, massacres of innocent people, driven purely by panic and prejudice. In some regions, witchcraft became the scapegoat. Innocent men and women, accused of dark magic, faced brutal interrogations and executions. Fear and desperation turned friends against friends, neighbours against neighbours. If you found yourself sick during this frenzy, you'd quickly realize medical attention wasn't your only worry. You'd be afraid to ask for help, fearing isolation or worse, accusation and violence. As society unraveled, everyday life became a terrifying gamble. Markets shut down, trade ceased, and famine set in as fields went unattended and livestock died. Finding food, clean water, or even shelter became nearly impossible. Law and order collapsed as authorities either succumbed to illness or fled to isolated areas. Crimes like robbery and theft exploded as desperate people struggled to survive. Imagine stepping outside your home each day, never knowing whether you'd return safely or at all. Even burying the dead became impossible. Bodies piled up in streets, fields and rivers because there simply weren't enough healthy people left to bury them. Picture the psychological trauma of seeing your town filled with the dead and dying each day. Your odds of survival were based purely on chance. Some families remained untouched, while others were completely wiped out. There was no strategy, just luck. If the plague missed your house, it might strike your neighbor instead. As death tolls skyrocketed, medieval society simply couldn't hold together. Entire villages were abandoned, urban economies collapsed, and trade nearly disappeared. Governments struggled to function, often losing their rulers and leaders to illness. Economically, those who survived found themselves in a completely changed world. Skilled laborers became scarce, dramatically altering social structures. Surprisingly, peasants suddenly found their labor more valuable, sparking revolts against nobles desperate to maintain the old ways. But amid all this turmoil, something unexpected began. The plague indirectly paved the way for eventual social changes, improved hygiene practices, and the slow birth of modern medicine. Looking back, it's clear if you'd lived in medieval Europe during the Black Plague, survival would have required extraordinary luck. No amount of bravery, strength, or even knowledge available at the time could guarantee your survival. But today we can learn from this history, improving our preparedness, understanding the importance of hygiene, and appreciating how far we've come medically. So, next time you're washing your hands or seeing a doctor, remember your medieval self wouldn't have stood a chance.